Hello, hello. I think there are some ways in which technology is not helping us as much as it could. Actually, maybe not helping us at all. And while I love the reality that we can just, at the call up of a number, throw up an entire hymn text, it's divorcing you of familiarity with a very, very useful tool in your lives. It's called a hymn book. And you guys are quickly losing track of what the benefit of books are. In that hymn book, there's lots of good, useful information. But I want to ask you a question. What part of what's in that hymn book is the hymn? Do you know what a hymn, H-Y-M-N, is? I have some blank looks. I have some sleepy looks. I have some inquisitive looks. I had a couple of knowledgeable looks. I heard a good answer, but you didn't, because it was close to me. The hymn is the part that you actually get to see when you don't open your hymn book. It's the words. The other part of what's on the page is called the tune. And there's actually, we had in early Adventism a songbook called Hymns and Tunes. What was really interesting about that particular book is that the hymns were in one part of the book and the tunes were in another part of the book. Hymns and tunes. In fact, in the 18th century, if you went to a church, you probably would not see what we see today. In fact, I can tell you, you wouldn't see what we have today because books were really expensive and they weren't printed and published. You would see the words published, but you wouldn't see the music published. It was just too hard to do that back then. And so each church would have its own set of tunes. It would have a tune for what they called long meter, and a tune for what they called common meter, a tune for what they called short meter. And then the hymn texts were the poems, the words, and they would pick a tune that fit the text, and then they would sing that text to this tune. And if the next text had the same rhythm, they would sing it to the same tune. And if the next text had the same rhythm, they would sing it to the same tune. And then they'd pick the next text and they'd try and sing it to that tune and it wouldn't fit the meter. Oh, sorry, that was long meter, that wasn't common meter. Let's find the long meter tune. Okay, we'll sing it to the long meter tune. And so a church would only have a dozen tunes, and every hymn you sang every week would be sung to one of those tunes. Some people actually picked which church they attended by which set of tunes they used. And if somebody brought a new hymn, well, you just check out the meter and you'd sing it to the tune you already know. It was no problem. Today, we have a tune for every text. But it didn't used to be that way. And in this particular instance, Father, lead me day by day. What do you think came first, the text or the tune? I heard text over here. And the rest of you are still asleep. Or at least not admitting to being awake yet. The tune came 100 years before the text. The tune was composed in Germany. The text was written in England. But they come together into a very important message. Father, lead me day by day. When the text was written, it wasn't called Father, lead me day by day. It was called a child's prayer for guidance. What does it take to be a child? What makes a child a child? Ignorance, immaturity, irresponsibility. I got a few guys waking up. The girls are still asleep. Pardon? Innocence. I like the positive side. The guys are showing up all the negative stuff. Parents. So as long as you have parents, you're a child. Then I was a child right up until about 2 years ago. Age. So what age do we stop being a child? She says 30. You never stop being a child? There's no hard and fast rule for these questions, okay? Get used to it. Life has lots of questions without hard and fast rules. But in general, most societies believe a child is a child until they come to the age where they can be responsible for their own decisions. How's that? Until you are responsible for your own decisions. At what point did you know the difference between right and wrong? Ooh, maybe I should be careful about that question. You might not think you know yet. When do you know the difference between right and wrong? Traditionally in Jewish society, it was at the age of 12. When you turned 12, you became a son of the law. Bar mitzvah. Or a daughter of the law, bat mitzvah. And that was the age at which you were no longer a child. You were now an adult. You were responsible for your own understanding. A hymn, a child's hymn for guidance. We underestimate sometimes the importance of the lessons we learn in childhood. Today, in today's society, we don't make children responsible like they used to be. Do you realize that 200 years ago, at the age that you are now, I don't care how young you are, even the youngest one sitting here, you could run your family farm. You could be responsible for taking care of the entire family as a young person. Because by the time you would make it to the age of a freshman, you were able to do everything the farm had. We didn't used to have this thing called teenage. Teenage is a modern phenomenon. It started after World War II. It's only been in the last 100 years that teenagers even existed. You used to be a child, then you were an adult. Now we've got this in-between thing. We call them teenagers. And we don't know what to do with them, and they don't know what to do. Because you're not children and you're not adults, and you know it's a tough place for you to be. But I'd like to suggest that God, even in this difficult in-between time that you are existing in, God has plans for you to be developing your character. And we're going to be looking a little bit at character development, some of it that took place at quite of a young age. In today's lesson, in today's material, but before I go any farther, I have a need, and I wonder if you would please indulge me in it. I need to talk to my Father one more time before I finish sharing with you this morning. Would you please pray with me? Good morning, Father. You know, no matter how young we are or how we might call ourselves, Father is unchanging, and we're grateful that you are unchanging. And Father, I'm coming to you this morning amazed that you continue to choose unprofitable servants to speak for you. Because I'm about as unprofitable as they come. But I'm grateful to you that you have chosen me and each of my friends here to grow us into workers for you. And this morning I'm just asking that somehow your Holy Spirit will be able to bring a message that has no life in itself to life. And that you will help us to understand the lessons that are contained here. so that you can be honored. And I thank you for meeting that need, because we're asking in the worthy name of Jesus. Amen. Now, if you remember, Monday we asked the question, why are you here? Why are you here? And we can't really answer that question without understanding something about Ed Southerland. Ed Southerland's grandfather was trained in Scotland. He was a scholar. He was also a preacher. In fact, the two commonly went together back in the 1700s. Preachers and scholars were kind of synonymous. And he moved from Scotland to Canada. And then from Canada, he moved to Wisconsin. And he was a scholar and he was a preacher, but he was not a farmer. He pretty much didn't know anything about farming. And so because it was a farming economy and a farming community, he was like a duck out of water. Now, if he'd had somebody that wanted to learn Latin, he could have taught them Latin. He could have instructed them in Greek. But trying to instruct them in weeding, well, it was just kind of out of his bailiwick. And so Ed Southerland's grandfather didn't really provide for the family very well. And it fell to his grandmother to take care of the family, to make sure that the family's needs were met, to pull the family together. And Ed Southerland's dad resented it. He thought of Ed's grandfather, his father, as being irresponsible. And he attributed that irresponsibility to something that was a frustration to him for the rest of his life. He attributed it to education. Education makes people useless. If you're educated, you can't do anything. And you know that's true of a lot of educated people. They can't do anything. Well, they settled in Wisconsin, and not too far away from the Southerland farm, there was another family. The family was called the Rankins. Now, the Rankin family had 8 red-headed daughters. And Ed Southerland took a liking to one of those red-headed daughters. Excuse me, Ed's father, Joseph Southerland. Joe Southerland took a liking to one of those red-headed daughters. Her name was Mary. Mary Rankin. And even though the country was in the upheaval of a civil war, Joe Southerland and Mary Rankin got married. And Joe was wanting to make it on his own. He was wanting to make his own mark on the world. And so he took Mary, and they decided that they were going to head from Wisconsin over to Iowa. There was a community over there of farmers. Many of them were Adventists, and they were thinking, this would be a good place for us to live. The land is fertile. There's opportunity. We'll go and we'll establish our lives. Now, Mary was pregnant. Joe and Mary, does this ring a bell to you? Joe and Mary? Joseph and Mary is pregnant, and they're taking a long trip, and the trip is not by car or plane, it's by wagon, and they're headed across country, and they get as far as the Mississippi River, and of course you can't just drive your wagon across the Mississippi River. Well, some people say there was a bridge there, but in my historical research, I haven't found that there was a bridge. They probably had to wait for a ferry in order to get their wagon across the river. And what do you suppose happened while they were waiting to get their wagon across the river? You're right. Edward Alexander was born. Depending on whose account you listen to, he was either born on the bridge across the river, because they hadn't made it to the other side yet. They said he was born in Wisconsin and not in Iowa. Very probably he was born in the wagon. Not maybe a very auspicious start to life. And a pretty rugged one in some ways. But ruggedness isn't all bad. Ruggedness helps to build and develop character. And this was true for Ed Southerland as too. In fact, as a young, there's the Mississippi River right there at Prairie du Chien. Dog meadow in French. That's where he was born, right there on the shores of the Mississippi River. I think it was on the shore. If you want to think it was on the bridge, that's okay. Ed learned lessons really early on about what hard work was like when he was still a child by anybody's definition. He herded cows, kept the cows from wandering off. He and his sister did this. And they did this for an entire summer. In fact, they earned the grand sum of 1 penny per day between them. I'm not sure how they split the penny, but by the end of the summer, Ed had managed to save 35 cents. Now you know, just like I know, that there's this thing called inflation, and because of inflation, things are worth more, well, it depends on how you say that, okay? It costs more to buy something today. And so, what would 35 cents be like? 35 cents would be like, maybe $4. You ready to work all summer for $4? Does that sound like a tough row to hoe? But Ed did that, and he saved his 35 cents. In fact, he saved it all winter long. The next spring, he put it into onion sets, and he took care of those onions, and he raised that garden of onions, and he sold them for a pretty tidy profit. And even as a little guy, he had his first successful business. When he graduated from high school, the year after he graduated from high school, do we have any seniors here? All right, the year after he graduated from high school, I want you to be thinking next year, he taught school. Yeah, he rode his pony, Mouse, back and forth to the little country school where he taught. And then the summer after that, he went and he spent time in the home of Mrs. Josephine Gotzian. She was a well-to-do lady up in Wisconsin. She had been recently widowed and recently had become a Seventh-day Adventist. And so she allowed young men to come and stay in her home while they canvassed. They sold books. And Ed went and sold books. And while he was doing that, he learned some other lessons. First of all, he learned that Mrs. Gotzian, while being well-to-do, was also pretty frugal. Frugal is a good way of saying it. But some people don't understand that word. So if I told you stingy, would that make sense? Okay, but stingy is the bad side of frugal. She wasn't the bad side of frugal. She was just very, very careful with her money. In fact, in order to save her money, she would send Ed clear across town to buy milk every morning because the milk was just a little cheaper over on the other side of town. And Ed was happy to do that and care for her carriage horse and do some other things around the house. And it became a friendship between this young man and this woman that proved to be very beneficial. You're going to find out later on, but not later on today. It'll be later on in the story. Ed also that summer heard that John Harvey Kellogg, now he's a doctor, he was in charge of the Battle Creek Sanitarium. He was starting a new program for doctors, for physicians, to train new physicians. A program where if you came to be part of his program, you would do medical missionary training for a semester, and then you would go to medical school, and he would pay for your medical school as long as you worked for him when you got out. And Ed thought, I want to be a doctor. That's a good idea. I think I'm going to go do that. But his dad had other ideas. His dad, remember what he thought about education? Education makes you worthless. So Ed sold his pony Mouse so he could go to school. He got to school and he found out the program had been canceled. There had only been one other person, just two of them, that showed up for the program. It wasn't enough to make it worthwhile doing it, so they canceled the program. And here he is, he's at school. What's he going to do? Well, he wanted to learn, and his year of teaching school taught him there were some things he needed to know. He needed to do a little bit of studying. He especially needed to understand rhetoric and grammar a little bit better, so he started studying with Professor Goodloe Bell. Professor Bell understood rhetoric and grammar, and he could teach English really well, but he understood some other things too, and he had some kind of strange ideas about education. This guy was strange. I mean, he actually thought that the Bible had all the principles that you needed. Not that you shouldn't use any other textbooks, but every other textbook should be considered secondary to the principles that are held in the Bible. Can you believe making the Bible the guide of your life? Isn't that a strange idea? Well, it was to some people. And Professor Bell also thought that you ought to learn something. Ed's dad would have liked this. You ought to learn something besides bookwork. So they studied rhetoric and they studied grammar half the day, and the other half of the day they went out and they worked. Does that sound familiar? Well, after a year of that, Ed went back home. He started teaching again. He taught for 2 more years. And during harvest season, he helped his dad on the harvest because he believed it was the thing to do. Ought to help out at home. Now his dad, remember, he doesn't think too keenly of people who've gone off to get educated. So his dad gave him the toughest job in the harvest. It was a job called the straw monkey. After the threshing machine had threshed off the grain from the stalks, the straw monkey had to take those stalks and pitch them up onto the haystack. It was considered the hardest job. His mom objected to his dad. The other harvest workers objected to his dad. They said, "You shouldn't make this boy do that. I mean, he's gotten soft. He hasn't been working for a year." The work was hard. So was his dad. But he got through the harvest season, singing and praying his way through the harvest season without any complaints. And at the end of the harvest season, his dad looked at him and said, "Well, I guess maybe you got the right stuff after all. If you want to go to school, you can do that." And so he did. He went on back to Battle Creek College. He continued his education, and in his junior year there, he met Percy McGann. Percy McGann was an Irishman, and he'd been invited to live in the home of Ellen White. So with Ed spending a lot of time with Percy, guess who he's hanging out with? He's spending time with Mrs. White. Well, they didn't call her Mrs. White. They called her Mother White. They had a great relationship with her, and she called them the boys. She was quite a bit older than they were at this point in time. And while this is the house that the Whites used to live in, some of you juniors from last year may recognize it. Some of you juniors from this year are going to see it in about a week. Okay? It's not the house where Percy lived, because they sold this house. It was a number of years later that Percy was living in Ellen's home. Well, the boys learned a number of things from Mother White. What do you think it would be like to be living with a prophet? Would you think you'd look forward to that? Would that be a positive thing? Percy was quite a bit younger than Ed, but there were a number of things in his life that he'd learned that Ed hadn't learned yet, like a dynamic relationship with Jesus. But Percy was going to lead Ed into knowing those things. Percy had already yielded his life entirely to God's leading. He'd accepted the message of righteousness by faith in Jesus. Ed wasn't going to come to that experience for a couple of years. And the visits with Mother White and the long talks that they all had together on spiritual matters did root and ground the boys in Jesus, even though Ed had some growing to do in his experience. And they watched Mother White too. They saw her self-sacrificing. They noted her simple home and the peace and the joy that she had, and it just kind of spilled over to everybody else in the household. They came to know her standards for living, and they came to value the gift of prophecy that God had bestowed on this little woman. They were convinced that those messages did come from God, and that conviction was going to stand them very well over the next several years. Percy was 19 years old. Some of you not far from that. Ed was 23. Mother White at this time was widowed. James had died. She was 61. And there's a lot more that Ed's going to be learning from Percy and Mother White, but we're going to just kind of try and wrap up the lessons that Ed has learned up to this point. Ed's learned sacrifice. He had to sacrifice his beloved pony in order to be able to get an education. Ed's learned the principles of education from Professor Bell. He's learned about hard work under trying circumstances from his dad. You may feel like you've got some trying circumstances in your hard work some days. There's lessons to be learned in that. Don't shy away from it. He's learned humble service in the home of Mrs. Gotzian. He's learned about righteousness by faith. He learned it from Mother White, and he learned how to make it real in his life from Percy. He's learned about God's gift of prophecy that was given to Mother White, and he has a conviction that these messages are direct from God, and they should guide his life. And they did. And our adventure with Ed is only beginning. We'll continue this again. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, thank you for the lives of those who have faithfully served you, that serve as an excellent illustration for us to emulate. Please help us not to lose these lessons, for it's only as we remember how you've taught us in our past that we can have confidence in our future. Would you please help us to grow in you today, is our need and our prayer for Jesus' sake. Amen.